Sean's nights were endless. Surrounded by luxury, yet his soul lived in ruins. His bed was wide, his mansion silent, his heart heavy with scars no wealth could soothe. But then, on a restless evening, something changed. A voice floated into his world, soft, warm velvet in the way it touched the air. It wasn't just a song, it was a caress, a promise, a whisper against the wounds he carried. Each note slipped past his defenses, stirring feelings he thought had long died. Sean leaned into that sound, his chest rising, his pulse unsteady. And when his eyes finally found her, standing in the glow of a dim cafe stage, pouring her heart into every lyric, he knew this was no ordinary moment. Her voice didn't just sing, it reached inside him, broke through the bitterness, and touched the man he used to be. That night, the broken billionaire's story began, not with another deal or another fortune, but with a woman's voice that carried both healing and hope. Welcome, dear friends, to Mr. Leonardo's Stories. If you're new here, thank you for joining us, and if you've been here before, welcome back. Today's story is one you'll never forget. So before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because what you're about to hear is more than just a love story. It's a reminder that even the most shattered hearts can learn to beat again. Sean Harrington was a man the world envied. His name appeared on magazine covers beside the words visionary, genius, and billionaire. His company, Harrington Global, shaped industries. His glass towers pierced skylines across continents, a symbol of wealth and power that few could rival. But behind those polished titles was a man fractured beyond recognition. Every morning, Sean woke in a bed wide enough for two, yet empty. His mansion, tucked in the heart of the city, stretched with silence so heavy it pressed against his chest. Wealth had never felt more useless. What good was a collection of sports cars when his heart drove only in circles of regret? What meaning was there in million-dollar meetings when no laughter filled the echo of his halls? The betrayal still haunted him. Once he had loved fiercely, trusted deeply, only to discover the cruel truth, that she had wanted his fortune more than his soul. She had left him shattered, with scars invisible to the public eye, but etched into every breath he took. The world saw a powerful CEO, but in the quiet hours of the night, Sean was just a man drowning. His insomnia was merciless. He would lie awake staring at the ceiling, mind replaying memories he wished he could erase. Anxiety gnawed at him, bitterness became his closest companion, and though women still lingered at every gala and event, none touched his heart. Their smiles were too rehearsed, their intentions too transparent. Sean was lonely, but he was also guarded. His life had become a cycle: meetings, numbers, acquisitions, empty dinners, and nights with nothing but silence and shadows. He tried filling the void with work, but work couldn't whisper to him in the dark. He tried burying himself in power, but power couldn't hold him when he shook from nightmares. The truth was simple yet brutal: money couldn't heal him. And though the world envied Sean Harrington, he envied every couple he passed on the street holding hands. Every time he heard laughter ripple from a cafe, a pang stabbed him deeper than any corporate betrayal. He wanted a connection. He wanted warmth. He wanted a reason to breathe again. But his heart had learned not to hope. Until that night when everything shifted. Sean, restless and unable to sleep, drove through the city aimlessly. Neon lights reflected off his windshield, glowing like ghosts of a world he didn't belong to. His mind ached, his chest was heavy, and for reasons he couldn't explain. He pulled his car beside a small cafe tucked between taller buildings. Music floated faintly through its doors, gentle, rich, alluring. It was nothing like the rehearsed performances of opera halls or luxury events he usually endured. This was raw, honest, a voice pouring from the soul. And as Sean pushed open the cafe doors, the warmth of the room wrapped around him. People sat at small tables, their faces soft with peace, but his eyes locked instantly on her. A woman. Her lips brushed the microphone, her eyes closed as though she was lost inside the song. Every note dripped with emotion, caressing the air, filling the silence inside him that wealth had never touched. Her voice wasn't just sound, It was touch, memory, hope, all woven into melody. And Sean Harrington, the billionaire everyone thought untouchable, felt his chest tighten. His pulse stuttered. His loneliness cracked for the first time in years. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew her voice had just found a way into the places he thought no one could ever reach again. Sean Harrington's nights were battles. He dreaded the dark hours when the city outside quieted and he was left alone with himself. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was shallow, fractured, haunted by memories he didn't want. Most nights, he simply lay there, eyes open, staring into the endless black above him. Sometimes, he tried distracting himself, scrolling through endless financial reports on his tablet, watching the news until the screen blurred before his tired eyes, or pouring himself expensive whiskey that never seemed to dull the ache. But none of it worked. It wasn't his body that refused to rest, it was his mind. His thoughts ran like wild horses he could not tame. The sting of betrayal replayed like a cruel film on loop. Her voice, her lies, the way she'd once held his face as if she loved him, only to walk away with his trust shattered. He told himself he should be over it by now, but scars have their own stubborn way of keeping time. On some nights, he paced the vast hallways of his mansion, barefoot, running, a hand along the cold walls as if touching them might anchor him. But the silence was suffocating, the air heavy with loneliness. On other nights, he sat in his library, surrounded by shelves of books he never read anymore. He used to love words, used to devour stories when he was younger, but lately, even stories couldn't quiet his demons. He would stare at the pages, rereading the same line over and over, unable to focus. Sometimes, he sat by the window overlooking the city, watching the lights blink. In the skyscrapers, wondering if anyone else out there was as hollow as he was. He envied the simple things he couldn't buy: warm laughter behind closed curtains, whispers between lovers, a child's giggle in the dead of night. He had the world's riches, but not one of those treasures belonged to him. And then there were nights when his body betrayed him entirely, sweat on his brow, hands trembling, heart racing from panic attacks that struck without warning. He hated those nights the most. For a man the world thought was unshakable, Sean Harrington would sit on the floor of his room with his knees pulled to his chest, feeling like a broken boy no empire could save. The insomnia ate at him slowly. It dulled his smile at board meetings, sharpened his temper with colleagues, and deepened the shadows beneath his eyes. His assistant sometimes asked if he was all right, and he always brushed it off with a smooth lie. After all, who would believe the mighty billionaire couldn't even fight for his own rest? Still, beneath all the turmoil, there was one truth Sean couldn't escape. He wasn't looking for sleep. He was looking for peace. And peace was something money had never been able to buy. Sean sat at the edge of his bed, running his hands through his hair as another sleepless night pulled him back into memories. No matter how hard he tried, his mind always wandered to her, the woman he once thought would be his forever. He remembered the early days, the way her laughter filled the silence he used to hate. Back then, she had made him believe he wasn't just a billionaire, not just a CEO, but a man worthy of being loved. She had been attentive, gentle, whispering promises into his ear late at night. "You work too hard, Sean," she had teased once, curling against him as they sat on the balcony. "One day you'll realize that life isn't about numbers or deals. It's about moments like this, just you and me." He had believed every word. He remembered the small things, the way she'd straighten his tie before a meeting, her fingers brushing his collar with tenderness, the way she'd rest her head on his chest when he was exhausted, murmuring that she was proud of him. For a man who had built an empire with steel and strategy, those moments had been his softest refuge. But the flashbacks never stopped at the sweetness. They always twisted, turning from warmth to ice. He remembered the night of her betrayal, not just the words she said, but the look in her eyes. Cold, detached. "Don't be naive, Sean," she had said, arms crossed, voice dripping with disdain. "Do you really think any woman could look at you without seeing dollar signs first?" The words cut him deeper than any blade. He had stood there, frozen, his heart torn in two as she walked away without even glancing back. The echo of her heels on marble had felt louder than thunder. From that night on, Sean built walls around himself. Not the kind of walls his company constructed from steel and glass, but invisible ones. Barriers no one could cross. He filled his life with contracts, acquisitions, and strategy meetings. But no matter how high the walls, the flashbacks always found cracks. And tonight was no different. Sean leaned back against his pillows, staring at the ceiling as guilt and rage gnawed at him. He hated that he still remembered the scent of her perfume, the way her lips curved when she lied. He hated that after everything she had taken from him, she still owned the quiet corners of his mind. But most of all, he hated himself. For believing, for trusting, for loving. A hollow laugh escaped his lips. Love. What a foolish illusion. He pressed a hand against his chest, as though he could physically quiet the storm inside him. But the storm had no mercy. The more he fought it, the louder the flashbacks became. It was then that Sean realized his insomnia wasn't just about sleeplessness. It was punishment. His own mind refuses to let him forget, refusing to let him move on. So he surrendered to the night. He threw on a dark suit jacket over his t-shirt and left the mansion. The echo of his own footsteps the only sound in the cavernous hallways. Driving aimlessly, neon lights blurred past his windshield, reflecting the emptiness in his eyes. He had no destination, no purpose in that moment, only the desperate need to escape the ghosts inside his head. And that was when he saw it. A small cafe, lights glowing softly against the dark street. A faint sound drifted from within, a voice, warm and melodic, carrying on the night air. It was unlike anything he had heard before. For reasons he couldn't explain, Sean slowed the car. He pulled over, his chest tightening. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped out, drawn to that sound like a man starving for something he couldn't name. The cafe door opened, and the voice wrapped around him, pulling him in. For the first time in years, Sean Harrington felt something other than emptiness. The cafe was small, tucked between tall, sleepless buildings, but the moment Sean stepped inside, it felt like he had walked into another world. Warmth wrapped around him, not just from the low amber lights that glowed above each table, but from the atmosphere itself. People sat quietly, their faces softened with peace, their eyes fixed on the stage at the far end. And there she was, Ivy. She stood beneath the glow of a single spotlight, microphone cradled in her hand. Her skin glistened like rich mahogany, and her hair cascaded in waves that framed her face. But it wasn't her beauty that struck Sean first. It was her voice. It was liquid honey poured into the silence. It was velvet against his scars. It was both fire and balm, awakening and soothing at once. Sean froze in place, his hand tightening around the back of a chair, as though steadying himself against a force he couldn't control. Her eyes were closed as she sang, every note carrying a piece of her soul. She wasn't performing for fame or applause. No, Ivy was singing like it was a prayer, like it was oxygen, like her entire existence was stitched into every lyric. And the room responded. Conversations hushed. Cups of coffee cooled in forgotten hands. Even the air seemed to pause, holding its breath to let her voice float through. For Sean, it was something deeper. The tension in his chest began to ease. The pounding echoes of betrayal quieted. He felt lighter. It unnerved him. He wasn't a man easily moved. He'd sat through symphonies, private concerts, operas sung by voices that had been trained in the finest halls of Europe. None of them had ever reached him like this woman's song did in a modest cafe. When her voice climbed to a higher note, his breath hitched, his throat tightening, as though she were peeling away every layer he had hidden behind. And for a fleeting moment, Sean Harrington wasn't the billionaire CEO, the broken man haunted by betrayal, the insomniac who couldn't find peace. He was simply Sean, just a man, caught in the spell of a voice that made him believe healing might be possible. She opened her eyes then, and in that instant they found his. Her gaze was warm, steady, almost curious, as though she sensed the storm he carried inside. It was brief, just a second, but it was enough to send a current through him. His pulse quickened, and he looked away, suddenly overwhelmed. like she had seen too much without a word. When her song ended, the room erupted in applause. Sean didn't move. He couldn't. He just sat there, staring, trying to steady himself. He didn't even know her name yet, but he knew one thing. He would be back. Sean lingered in the corner of the cafe long after the applause had died down. He wasn't used to sitting in shadows, watching quietly, usually. He was the man people turned to, the center of every room. But here, in this warm little world, he was invisible. And strangely, he wanted it that way. On stage, Ivy gave a shy smile, one hand brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She wasn't dressed like someone trying to impress. A soft cream blouse, dark jeans, and a pair of worn heels. It was clear her goal wasn't glamour. No, Ivy sang because she had to, and Sean could sense it, even without knowing her story. For Ivy, music wasn't just a passion, it was survival. Life had not made things easy for her. She'd grown up in a small neighborhood where dreams often wilted before they bloomed. Her father worked long hours in construction, her mother sold handmade jewelry at the local market, and Ivy had learned early on that nothing in life was handed to her. But her voice was the one gift she couldn't ignore. As a child, she'd hum to soothe her siblings when storms rattled their roof. As a teenager, she sang in church choirs, her voice lifting tired souls. And as an adult, she found herself here, in this little cafe, singing for strangers who didn't know her name, but always left lighter than they came. Yet, Ivy carried her own scars. There had been auditions that ended in rejection, doors closed before she could step through them, and promises from people who said they'd help her career, only to vanish when she couldn't give them what they wanted. She knew the sting of being underestimated, the ache of chasing a dream with little more than grit to keep her going. Still, Ivy never stopped. Her belief was simple. If her voice could heal even one person, if her music could remind someone they weren't alone, then it was worth it. Sean didn't know all of that yet, but he felt it. Every note she sang seemed laced with her story, her pain, and her resilience. It wasn't polished perfection. No, it was raw, vulnerable, alive. And that was what made it beautiful. When her set ended, she stepped down from the stage, carrying herself with quiet grace. She walked to the counter, ordered tea instead of champagne, and sat at a corner table with a notebook. Sean couldn't stop his eyes from following her. He noticed the way she scribbled lyrics absent-mindedly, tapping the pen against her chin, the way she smiled softly at the barista who refilled her cup, gratitude in her eyes even for the smallest kindness. And then, for a fleeting moment, her gaze lifted. Their eyes met again. Sean's breath caught. This time, she didn't look away quickly. She held his stare, as if trying to place him. But there was no recognition in her expression, no awareness that she was staring at one of the most powerful men in the city. She just saw him, not the billionaire, not the headline, just a man sitting alone in a cafe. And for Sean, that was more disarming than anything. He should have left then. He told himself he didn't belong in her world. But something kept him rooted to that chair, unwilling to let go of the warmth she had sparked in him. For the first time in years, Sean Harrington didn't feel completely broken, and it was all because of her voice. Sean stayed longer than he meant to. The cafe was beginning to thin out, the soft chatter fading as people slipped into the night. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. Ivy sat in her corner, humming softly as she scribbled lyrics in her notebook. Her voice was quieter now, unaccompanied by a microphone or instruments, but it still carried like a secret melody meant only for herself. Sean's hand tightened around the coffee cup he hadn't touched in an hour. He wanted to go to her, to tell her how her voice had silenced the storm in him for the first time in years. He wanted to thank her, to ask her how she could sing with such soul, to let her. No, she had done for him what all the wealth in the world had failed to do, but his body refused to move. What would he even say? That a broken billionaire had stumbled into a cafe and found healing in her voice? That her song had touched scars he had never shown another soul? He imagined her reaction, confused, maybe even wary. She didn't know him. To her, he was just another man in the crowd. and maybe that was the only reason he felt safe sitting there at all. Still, his eyes betrayed him. They kept finding her, tracing the curve of her cheek as she smiled at something she wrote, the way her lips pursed when she crossed out a word, the grace in her every small movement. And for a moment, Sean allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to walk over. He pictured himself standing beside her table, clearing his throat softly. She would look up, her eyes meeting his, curious and warm. He would tell her, awkwardly at first, how her voice had stopped him in. His tracks, how it had reached places in him nothing else ever had. She would smile, maybe laugh gently, dismissing the praise, but he'd see it in her eyes, that she understood. He wanted that moment, craved it. His chair scraped softly as he shifted, almost rising. His pulse quickened, his breath caught. He was ready to take a step, but then doubt whispered, "She doesn't need you. Don't ruin this." Sean froze. Years of rejection, years of betrayal wrapped around his throat like chains, dragging him back down. What right did he have to approach someone like her, to pull his brokenness into her light? So instead, he stayed where he was, watching quietly, letting the moment slip through his fingers. At last, Ivy gathered her things, her notebook tucked under her arm, her tea finished, her shoulders wrapped in a light shawl. She gave the barista a grateful smile before heading for the door. Sean's heart pounded as she walked past him, her perfume brushing the air between them. She didn't glance his way. She didn't need to. He already knew she had left an imprint on him that wouldn't fade. And as the cafe door closed behind her, Sean remained seated in the quiet, more awake than he had been in years. For the first time in so long, he wasn't afraid of the night. He was afraid of never hearing her voice again. Sean Harrington had never been a man of routine outside of his business. His days were dictated by markets, contracts, and meetings. But now, without meaning to, he found himself forming a new ritual, one that had nothing to do with profits or power. Every few nights he returned to the cafe, always quiet, always in the corner, always watching. He told himself it was just a coincidence at first, that he happened to drive by, that it was curiosity more than anything. But the truth pressed against him like an undeniable tide. He was drawn to her, to Ivy. Her voice had become his medicine. The nights he sat in the dim cafe listening to her sing were the only ones when his chest didn't feel like a cage. The insomnia didn't disappear, but it softened. And for a man who had long believed he was beyond repair, even a moment of peace was priceless. It didn't take long for Ivy to notice him. At first he was just another face in the crowd. A man in expensive suits who sat alone, never with company, never drinking more than a single coffee. But then she realized he was always there, always silent, always watching, her with eyes that carried a weight she couldn't quite name. She wondered about him. Who was he? Why did he never speak to anyone? Why did his gaze feel so heavy, as if he wasn't just listening to her voice, but searching for something inside it? One night, after finishing her set, she walked past his table. Their eyes met again, brief but piercing. She gave him a polite smile, the kind she offered every customer. But this time, something stirred in her chest. There was pain in his eyes, deep, raw, unspoken pain. And yet, there was also longing. It was nearly closing time when the first words passed between them. Ivy had returned to the counter to thank the barista, and Sean, almost against his own will, rose from his corner table. Their paths crossed by the door. "Your voice," he said quietly, his tone lower, steadier than he felt. "It's remarkable." Ivy blinked, surprised. "Thank you." She tilted her head, studying him a little closer. "Do you come here often?" Sean hesitated. He wanted to say no, to protect the shield of mystery around himself. But the truth slipped out. Lately, yes. A small smile curved her lips. "Then I guess I'll see you again." Her words were simple, polite, nothing extraordinary. But to Sean, they felt like sunlight cracking through his dark sky. From that night on, their exchanges grew. At first, just greetings, "Good evening," "Beautiful song tonight," "Thank you." But slowly, the words began to stretch. One night, She asked him what he did for a living. He paused, unwilling to reveal the truth. "Business," he said vaguely. She didn't push. Another night, she noticed the shadows under his eyes. "You don't sleep much, do you?" The question caught him off guard. He gave a half smile. "Not well." Then, "I hope my songs help." Even a little. They did, more than she would ever know. What struck Sean most was her warmth. She didn't know who he was. She didn't treat him like a billionaire, a prize, or a headline. To Ivy, he was just a man who came to listen. And that was exactly what he needed. What struck Ivy was his silence. Most men who noticed her tried to impress her with attention or charm. But this one didn't. He listened. He lingered. He carried himself like someone who had seen storms no one else could imagine. And though she didn't know why, she wanted to ease whatever burden he carried. And so, in that little cafe, between songs and quiet conversations, something fragile began to form. A spark, a connection neither of them had planned for, but one that would change them both. It was a quiet Thursday evening when the cafe was nearly empty. Rain pattered softly against the windows, blurring the city lights outside. Ivy had just finished her last set, her voice still lingering in the air like perfume. Sean sat at his usual corner table, his untouched coffee cooling before him. Tonight, he looked even more withdrawn than usual, his shoulders tense, his gaze distant, as though his mind was trapped somewhere far darker than the warm little cafe. Ivy noticed. Something inside her stirred, a pull she couldn't explain. For weeks she had seen him come and go, always quiet, always watchful, always alone. But tonight, she didn't want to let him leave that way again. So she gathered her courage, wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and walked toward his table. Sean looked up, startled. He wasn't used to people approaching him unless they wanted something. But Ivy's eyes weren't calculating or greedy. They were warm, curious, genuinely kind. "Do you mind?" she asked softly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Sean hesitated. No one ever sat at his table. His instinct was to decline, to guard himself, but his lips betrayed him. "Please." She sat, her notebook resting on the table, her fingers tracing its edges. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was charged, delicate, full of unspoken things. Finally, Ivy smiled gently. "You always sit here alone, and you always listen like the songs mean more to you than the rest of the room. Why?" Sean's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her everything, that her voice was the only thing that reached him, that without it he would still be drowning. But years of pain had taught him caution. Instead, he said, "Because your voice feels like the first thing in a long time that's real." Her eyes softened, her lips parting slightly at the honesty. She held his gaze for a moment longer before replying, "Then maybe I'm not the only one who needs these songs." For Sean, the words were like a hand pressed gently against his scars. Not demanding, not probing, just there. They didn't speak much more that night, but something shifted. Ivy had crossed the invisible line between singer and stranger, and for the first time, Sean didn't feel like just a man in the shadows. He felt seen. From that night on, the distance between them began to shrink. Sean still returned to the cafe, but now Ivy didn't just notice him, she acknowledged him. Some evenings, after her sets, she would join him for a few minutes. At first, their conversations were small, careful, cautious. "Long day?" she would ask, her chin resting on her hand as she sipped tea. "Every day feels long," Sean would reply with a wry smile. She laughed softly, the sound like music itself. "Maybe you're working too hard." Other nights, she shared pieces of herself. How she dreamed of opening a small studio where young voices from her neighborhood could find hope in music. How she believed songs could heal wounds words never could. Sean listened, more captivated than he cared to admit. Her dreams weren't about money or fame. They were about purpose, about giving light. It was so different from the cold world he knew. One evening, she read him a piece of poetry she had scribbled in her notebook. Her voice was softer than when she sang, but it carried the same weight, every word dripping with meaning. Sean closed his eyes as she read, letting the cadence wrap around him like balm. "Do you always write?" he asked when she finished. "Always," she replied, smiling faintly. "It keeps me sane." Then she tilted her head at him. "What keeps you sane?" Sean's lips curved into the faintest, almost broken smile. "Lately, this." He gestured between her and the notebook. "You." Her breath caught, her eyes flickering to his. The air between them grew charged, intimate, though neither dared to cross that invisible line. Their bond grew in fragments, small, intimate moments that stitched themselves into something unbreakable. The way her hand brushed his when she passed him her notebook, sending a spark through him. The way he leaned closer when she spoke, his gaze fixed on her lips, though he didn't realize it. The way she smiled differently at him than at anyone else, soft, reserved, almost protective. For Sean, these moments were dangerous. He hadn't felt them in years, and the vulnerability frightened him. But Ivy's presence chipped away at his walls without force, without demand. He wasn't falling fast. He was falling quietly, deeply. And though neither of them said it yet, they both knew something was beginning. The city was alive with its usual rhythm the night Sean offered to walk Ivy home. The cafe had closed late, and only a handful of patrons lingered as Ivy packed up her notebook and sheet music. Outside, rain had begun to fall, a steady drizzle that softened the glow of the street lamps. Sean rose from his table, slipping on his coat. He wasn't sure why he said it, but the words left his lips before he could stop them. "Let me walk you home." Ivy looked up, surprised. Her eyes lingered on him, searching, as though weighing whether to trust this man she barely knew. But then her lips curved into a faint smile. "All right." The streets were quiet as they walked side by side. Ivy held her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but Sean noticed how. The drizzle dampened her curls, droplets clinging to her lashes. Something about her in the rain felt unreal, like she wasn't just a woman but a song in human form. Sean slipped off his coat and draped it around her shoulders without a word. She glanced up at him, warmth flickering in her eyes. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied simply. Their steps fell into rhythm, the only sounds the patter of rain and the distant hum of the city. For once, Sean didn't feel the need to fill the silence. With Ivy, silence wasn't empty, it was alive. As they turned a corner, Ivy stumbled slightly on the wet pavement. Sean's hand shot out, steadying her. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm, firm, protective. The touch lingered longer than it should have. Ivy's breath caught, and when she looked at him, the space between them seemed to shrink. His hand didn't fall away immediately, and hers didn't pull back. The rain fell harder, soaking them both. But neither moved. For Sean, that simple touch was more intimate than anything he had felt in years. It wasn't about desire, it was about connection. "You have the look of a man carrying the world on his shoulders," Ivy said softly, her eyes searching his. Sean swallowed hard. "And you sing like someone who's already carried it and survived." Her lips parted, her chest rising as if she wanted to say more, but the moment stretched between them. Sweet, fragile, undeniable. They stopped beneath a streetlight near Ivy's apartment. The rain shimmered around them, droplets glowing like falling stars. Sean stood close, his eyes tracing her face, memorizing every curve, every shadow. For a heartbeat, he considered leaning closer, closing the distance. But something held him back. He wasn't ready, not yet. The fear of breaking what was slowly building between them kept him still. Ivy seemed to sense it. She gave him a gentle smile, her hand brushing his lightly before she stepped back. "Thank you for walking me." Sean nodded, his voice low. "Any time." She turned toward her building, but before disappearing inside, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. Their eyes met through the rain, and though no words were spoken, everything was understood. That night, Sean walked back alone, but for the first time in years, he wasn't haunted by insomnia. He wasn't consumed by flashbacks. He was consumed by her, by Ivy. The rain had returned, tapping against the city streets in a rhythm that seemed to echo Sean's own heart. He hadn't meant to stay this late, hadn't meant to linger in the cafe, long after Ivy's last set, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way she looked at him earlier, her eyes soft but searching. Maybe it was the way her smile carried something that felt meant just for him. Whatever it was, when she slipped her notebook into her bag and turned toward him, Sean found himself hoping she wouldn't just say goodnight. Instead, she asked the one question he hadn't been prepared for. "Would you like to walk me home again?" Sean hesitated only a second before nodding. Yes. The rain softened as they walked, their steps falling into the same unspoken rhythm they had discovered days ago. This time, though, Sean wasn't just walking her home. Tonight, Ivy stopped at the steps of her small apartment building, turned toward him with a shy, hesitant look, and whispered, "Do you want to come up? Just for tea?" Sean's chest tightened. He wasn't used to invitations without hidden motives. In his world, every gesture came with strings. Yet her eyes carried no demand, no calculation, only warmth. "Yes," he said softly, surprising himself. Her apartment was modest but alive with character. Small plants lined the windowsill, books were stacked in uneven piles, and sheet music covered the coffee table. A guitar leaned against the wall, its wood slightly worn. The space was nothing like the sterile luxury of his mansion. It felt lived in, loved, real. Sean stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. He felt like a giant in her world, out of place yet oddly at home. "You can sit," Ivy said gently, motioning toward the couch as she moved to the small kitchen. "Tea won't take long." Sean lowered himself onto the couch, his gaze falling to the notebook she'd left open. Lyrics danced across the page in her elegant handwriting. He traced the words silently, struck by their raw honesty. "Some wounds don't bleed, but they never close. Some hearts don't beat, but they never die." He closed the notebook softly as Ivy returned, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "You write what you sing," he said. "Most of the time," she replied, handing him a cup. "It's easier to put my heart on paper before I can share it out loud." She studied him for a moment. "Do you write?" Sean chuckled faintly. "Contracts mostly. Things with numbers and clauses. Nothing worth singing about." Ivy tilted her head, smiling softly. "You look like a man who has a story worth telling, even if it hurts." The words slipped past her lips so easily, but they landed heavy in Sean's chest. For a long time, he stayed silent, staring into the tea, watching the steam curl and fade. His instinct was to hold it in, to keep his wounds sealed where no one could touch them. But Ivy waited. She didn't push, didn't rush him. She just sat there, her presence steady, her eyes kind. And for the first time in years, Sean spoke. "I used to believe in love," he began quietly. His voice sounded foreign, even to himself. "I thought I had found it. I trusted her with everything, my time, my dreams, my soul. But it wasn't me she wanted. It was the empire, the power, the money. I was just convenient." His throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. "I heard her say it, that she would never love me, that I was just useful. I confronted her, and she didn't even deny it. She left without looking back. And since then," he exhaled, running a hand over his face, "since then, I've been hollow. I don't sleep. I don't trust. And no matter how many towers I build, no matter how much wealth I collect, none of it fills the silence she left behind." Ivy's chest ached as she listened. She could hear the raw truth in his words, the vulnerability he hadn't shown anyone else. His reputation might have been built on steel and numbers, but this was the man beneath it all. "She broke you," Ivy whispered. Sean shook his head slowly. "No, I let her break me. I gave her that power." He looked at Ivy then, his eyes dark, haunted. "And I've hated myself for it ever since." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was intimate. Ivy reached across the couch, her fingers brushing his hand gently, grounding him. "You're not broken, Sean," she said softly. "You're human, and humans, we hurt. But we also heal." For a long moment, Sean just stared at her hand, resting lightly against his. The warmth seeped into his skin, into the places he thought had gone cold forever. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. He didn't feel judged. He didn't feel weak. He felt seen. For the first time, Sean Harrington wasn't carrying his wounds alone. The silence in Ivy's apartment stretched, soft and warm, like a blanket wrapped around both of them. Sean's confession still lingered in the air, raw and fragile, but he didn't regret it. For the first time he had spoken his truth, and instead of recoiling, Ivy had leaned closer. Her hand was still lightly on his, her touch steady, grounding. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke. "Can I tell you something?" Sean nodded, his voice quiet. "Anything. I know what it feels like to give your all and feel like it isn't enough," Ivy said softly. She sat back a little, her gaze distant as though she were pulling words from old wounds. "My dream has always been to sing. Not for fame, not for money, but because I believe music can heal the heart. It saved me more times than I can count." She paused, her fingers toying with the edge of her notebook. "But the world doesn't always see it that way. To some people, my voice was a novelty, something they could use for their gain. To others, it was dismissed entirely because I wasn't what they expected, too ordinary, too different, not polished enough." She let out a soft laugh, but it didn't hide the pain in her tone. "I've been turned away from auditions with nothing but a half-hearted smile and the word, 'next.' I've had people promise to help me, only to vanish when they realized I couldn't give them what they wanted in return. There were days I wondered if I should give it all up, find something safer, something that wouldn't keep breaking my heart." Her eyes met his then, glistening in the dim light. "But every time I tried to walk away from music, I felt like I was leaving myself behind. So I kept singing, even if it was just here in this little cafe. Because if even one person leaves lighter than they came, then maybe I'm doing what I was meant to do." Sean's chest tightened as he listened. She wasn't just telling him about her struggles, she was revealing her soul. And the strength it took to share that truth humbled him. "You deserve more," Sean whispered. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe. But for now, this is enough." The words hung between them, weaving their stories together. For the first time, Sean felt the edges of his pain softening, not because it disappeared, but because someone else understood. And Ivy, in turn, felt lighter, knowing she wasn't alone in carrying disappointment and wounds. They sat close on the couch, their mugs long forgotten on the table. Sean shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing hers, and neither pulled away. "You make it sound so easy," he said quietly. "To keep going despite everything." "It's not easy," Ivy replied. "It hurts. Some days I feel like giving up. But then I sing, and I remember who I am. Healing isn't about never hurting again, Sean. It's about choosing to keep living, even with the scars." Her words slipped past his defenses like sunlight through cracks. He turned his head, his eyes locking on hers. The warmth in her gaze was steady, unwavering. Slowly, almost cautiously, Sean reached up and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. His hand lingered, cupping her face gently. Ivy's breath caught, but she didn't move away. "You make me want to believe again," Sean murmured. "And maybe I need someone to remind me that I'm enough," Ivy replied softly. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but the moment was more intimate than anything he had known in years. Time blurred. They talked late into the night, about books Ivy loved, about Sean's favorite, city skylines, about dreams they were too afraid to admit to anyone else. Between words came silences, and those silences grew thick with longing. At one point, Ivy leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Sean stilled, hardly daring to breathe, then allowed his arm to wrap lightly around her. The warmth of her against him was overwhelming, not in desire but in peace. He had touched countless people in his life, shaking hands in boardrooms, posing for photographs, even shallow encounters that meant nothing. But this was different. This was trust. Ivy's breathing slowed, her body relaxing against him. Sean closed his eyes, his chin lightly brushing the top of her head. His heart, usually heavy, felt strangely steady. They didn't cross the line of passion that night. They didn't need to. The intimacy was already there, in the brush of hands, in the way she leaned into him, in the unspoken promise between them. For the first time in years, Sean Harrington fell asleep, not in bitterness, but in comfort. When morning light slipped through the blinds, Ivy stirred beside him, still curled against his shoulder. Sean blinked awake, momentarily disoriented, then realized what had happened. They had fallen asleep together on the couch. She shifted, blinking drowsily, then smiled. "Guess we talked too much." Sean gave a rare, genuine smile. "I could listen to you forever." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, silent, but full of understanding. They didn't need to say it out loud. The promise was there already. They would keep walking this journey together. And though neither of them knew what storms still lay ahead, one thing was certain: they had found in each other the beginning of healing. The week after their night on the couch felt like a new season neither of them had words for. Mornings found Sean awake before sunrise, not because sleep ran from him, but because something gentler stirred him. Messages from Ivy, small notes and warm voice memos that sounded like morning light. "Good morning, you. I'm making tea. If you were here, I'd add honey." He listened to them with a half smile that surprised even him. He would send back photos of quiet corners in his mansion he'd never noticed before, a stairwell washed in early light, steam curling from a cup, a window where the city turned soft. She replied with her own, a plant sprouting new leaves, a scribble of lyrics, the corner of her sheet music stand with a smudge of pencil on it. They began to build small rituals. On Tuesdays, she finished her last set, and he walked her home in unhurried steps, their conversation winding through music and memory. On Thursdays, he arrived early and waited while she tuned the guitar in the back room. He never offered to help, but he held the door with quiet care and kept the world away. Their closeness grew in detail, the way she pressed a palm to his chest when she laughed, the way he learned to listen for the tiny hitch in her breath before a high note. He discovered her love for poetry printed in thin chapbooks. She discovered his fondness for stories about bridges and city planners, the human choices behind steel and stone. They told each other secrets not because they were testing trust, but because it felt natural to set them down between them and watch them settle like feathers. One night, after closing, they cooked in her small kitchen. The room held the scent of ginger and garlic. The faucet dripped with a steady beat. He chopped vegetables with the intense focus of a man who controlled empires, and she teased him for measuring every slice. When the pot simmered and the room filled with warmth, she leaned her head against his shoulder and sighed. "Stay a little longer," she murmured. He did. They ate from the same bowl, sitting barefoot on the floor, backs against the cabinets. Her knee brushed his hand cupped her ankle lightly. Nothing about it was grand, everything about it felt like home. When they washed dishes, their fingers slipped across soapy porcelain and found each other. The touch lingered. He looked down, then up. She met his gaze. The pause stretched, not heavy, not rushed, just full. He bent, not far, only until his forehead rested against hers. Their breaths mingled. He kissed her, gentle at first, a question, then deeper, a promise. She answered with a soft sound that felt like the beginning of a song. It wasn't the kind of kiss that asked for more. It was the kind that said, "I'm here." That night, when he finally left, the streetlights seemed less cold. He drove home without the ache gnawing at him. On his nightstand, he placed her folded note. "Your heart is not a ruin. It's a room with the windows open." He slept with the paper under his hand, and for once, dreamed of rain on a warm roof and a voice that hummed him into peace. Peace rarely announces when it plans to leave. It just brushes past you on the way out. It started with a phone lifted too high, a quick snap from a table by the wall. The caption would later read something like, "Is that who I think it is?" Not quite a claim, not quite a question. The post traveled the city faster than a rumor in a crowded room. By noon the next day, a glossy blog had already assembled older photos and compared jawlines and watches. By evening, a headline pulsed through notifications. Billionaire seen leaving late-night cafe. Who's the woman? Ivy's name wasn't in the first round of posts. Her face was. The angle caught her smile as she stood at the door, shawl around her shoulders, Sean's coat over her arm. The comments spread in threads, some sweet, some sharp, many guessing, a few cruel in that way faceless words can be. When she saw it, she went still, not because she was ashamed of him. She wasn't. But because she knew how stories could swallow a person whole and spit out a version no one recognized. She closed her laptop softly and sat on the edge of her bed, the same bed where she had once counted songs instead of sheep, where she had promised herself she would sing even if no one listened. Her phone buzzed. Sean, I saw it. Are you okay? She typed, erased, typed again. I'm okay. Just surprised. He called instead of replying. His voice was calm, but she could hear the careful edges. I should have protected this better. You don't have to apologize for being seen, she said. She meant it. Still, the knot in her stomach sat stubborn and hard. The next day, 2 photographers waited across the street from the cafe. Their lenses blinked like extra eyes. When Ivy stepped outside on her break, one called out a question she didn't answer, not because she was afraid, but because she refused to feed a story that didn't belong to them. That evening, peers messaged her. Is it true? Is he really? Some wrote with delight, others with thinly veiled envy, a few with warnings. The cafe owner, Mr. Alvarez, pulled her aside to say he'd speak to anyone who bothered her. She thanked him and smiled, but her hands trembled when she tied her apron. Sean's world reacted faster. His assistant forwarded a bundle of alerts, the firm's head of communications suggested. A statement that said nothing, and a partner texted, "We should be mindful of optics." Another, "Timing is sensitive." The new deal requires stability. A third, she seems. Nice, but is this wise? He ignored all but the first message and told his team he would call them later. He didn't want to explain Ivy like a decision. He didn't want to translate his heart into bullet points for people who were paid to turn human mess into tidy sentences. That night, he returned to the cafe through the side door. The barista nodded discreetly. Ivy sang like she always did. The same soft power, the same notes that knew how to find the places people hid. But when her eyes opened and met his, he saw the flicker of worry there. He set his hand on the back of the chair in front of him and breathed slowly, as if he could anchor her from across the room. After closing, they didn't go out the front. They sat in the back with the staff's leftover muffins and paper cups of tea. The room smelled like cinnamon and clean floors. She curled her feet onto the chair and leaned toward him. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I should have." "No," he shook his head. "No fault. Just light on something we hoped would stay quiet." She searched his face as if looking for a truth she could stand on. "Are you ashamed of being seen with me?" He flinched, a small, involuntary sound escaping. "I am proud to be near you," he said, steady. "I just don't like the look people get when they think they can own a story that isn't theirs." She exhaled and nodded. He reached across the table and laced their fingers. The kitchen clock ticked. In the front room, chairs sat upside down on tables like resting birds. For a moment, the world felt far away again. Still, when he walked her home later, a car rolled slowly behind them, windows dark. He put his arm around her shoulders and kept walking. The pressure didn't crash, it pressed. It arrived as calendar invites labeled brief check-in and voices that called him Sean, with the kind of tone that meant sir. It slid into meetings where charts flickered across screens and someone cleared his throat before mentioning distractions and market confidence. At the board table, Elaine Park, sharp, brilliant, loyal to the company's future, tapped a pen against a legal pad and said what others were circling. "We're negotiating 2 cross-border approvals. Anything that pulls headlines introduces uncertainty. You know how that works." "I do," he said. "I also know uncertainty doesn't end with a private life edited for press." A junior partner tried a different lane. "If you'd like, we can offer media coaching to Ivy, just to make sure if she's approached." Sean cut in. Voice calm. She is a singer. Not part of our firm. No one will contact her. Silence. Then the shuffle of papers. Someone moved the presentation along. He sat through the rest, spoke where he needed to, and signed what required his signature. When the elevator doors closed on his way down, he breathed out and pressed the back of his head against the wall for 3 slow seconds. The polished mirror returned a man who could buy half the street and still could not purchase a quiet life. He laughed once, softly, without humor. The cafe felt different that week. Regulars still clapped, still asked for the song about summer rain, and left napkin notes that said thank you. But there were new faces with phones held low. A woman at table 6 whispered to her friend and didn't look away when Ivy glanced up. Someone left a note in the tip jar that read, "Sing for the billionaire," with a winking face drawn beside it. Ivy folded the paper and set it in the trash without a word. She had another audition scheduled that Friday, the kind she rarely talked about because hopes kept quiet are easier to carry. The email had called her voice honest and the team excited to meet you. She wore her cream blouse and the earrings her mother had given her on the day she left home. She warmed up in the hallway and told herself she was not the internet story. She was a woman who sang. The panel was polite. They were also distracted. One of them whispered to another, a third scrolled through a phone and then smiled too brightly. "You have a unique tone," he said. "We're reviewing a few brand considerations at the moment. Sponsors sometimes prefer a certain profile. We'll be in touch." She thanked them and walked outside into the air that smelled like rain and car exhaust. She didn't cry. She sat on the steps and traced the edge of her music folder with one finger until the tremor in her hands subsided. Then she stood and went to the cafe early because playing through the set helped her breathe. Sean texted her at noon. How did it go? She told the truth. They were kind. It didn't fit. He didn't try to fix it with promises. He sent a voice memo instead. "I'm proud of you. I'll be there tonight." When he arrived, the room felt familiar and not. She sang a song he hadn't heard from her before, a low, steady thing that sounded like standing up after being pushed down. He knew it. Was new because the chords weren't smooth yet, and she watched her fingers once or twice to be sure. He also knew it was hers because it held a seam of light that nothing could smother. After her set, they stood near the back door. She held herself in a way that said the day had been long. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need this not to swallow me," she whispered. "I need the music to stay mine. I need to know I'm not a headline you'll let fade when it becomes inconvenient." He tightened his hold, then softened it. "I won't let you be swallowed, and you are never inconvenient to me." Her eyes glistened, not with drama, but with the frustration of a woman who has fought hard to keep tenderness from being turned into gossip. "Your world is loud," she said, "and mine is small on purpose." "I know." He nodded. "I'm learning how to let the noise pass without letting it inside." She breathed out and leaned against his chest. He kissed the top of her head. For a brief moment, the noise did pass. But noise has a way of circling the block. 2 days later, a business paper ran a column about leadership focus. It didn't name her, but it didn't need to. The editor used words like optics and timing, and narrative discipline. His inbox filled with polite alarm. A client asked for reassurance. A competitor posted a thin smile of a remark that sounded supportive if you didn't know how to read it. He cancelled 2 dinners, moved 3 meetings, and sent his assistant home early. Then he drove to Ivy's apartment without calling. She opened the door in a soft sweatshirt, hair pulled back, bare feet on cool floorboards. Relief moved through him like warmth. She stepped aside, he stepped in. The door clicked. The city hushed. "Rough day," he said. "Mine too." They stood in the narrow entryway, not touching, breathing the same quiet. She lifted a hand and smoothed his collar, a small act that grounded them both. He caught her fingers and kissed her knuckles slowly. She closed her eyes. The ache in both of them melted into something steadier. "Stay," she whispered. He did. They didn't talk business. They didn't open the internet. They made toast and ate it standing, laughing when the butter slid. He washed the plate, she dried it. They sat on the couch with their knees touching and played a game where they told each other a memory that had nothing to do with pain. He told her about the first time he saw the ocean as a boy and how small he felt in the best way. She told him about singing harmony with her mother at a kitchen table and how the room seemed to widen when their voices met. Later, when the light dimmed, he lowered his forehead to hers again. She sighed his name. He kissed her slowly, carefully, like they had all the hours. The room filled with the kind of quiet that feels full. Their hands traced safe paths, jawline, cheek, shoulder, the place where a pulse beats steady under skin. It was sensual the way harbor lights are sensual, soft, sure, guiding you home. They slept, not because they were tired, but because their bodies trusted each other enough to let go. Morning brought calls he couldn't ignore, and a look in her eyes he couldn't. Miss Reed, love paired with worry, the mix that makes people brave. Go, she said gently. Handle what you must. Come back. He nodded. I will. He kissed her once more at the door. As it shut, both of them knew the world waited outside with questions neither had chosen. The tension didn't explode. It seeped in slowly, like rain through a roof. By the end of the week, Ivy's cafe sets felt heavier. Some customers listened with sincerity. Others recorded on their phones, not for her music, but for proof that she was the woman. Each time, a flash blinked at the corner of her eye. She felt her sanctuary slipping from her grasp. Sean noticed. After one particularly crowded night, she lingered backstage, her hands clenched tight around her notebook. Sean found her there, eyes downcast, the weight of her silence louder than any song. What's wrong? He asked, voice gentle. Her head lifted, and her eyes burned with the kind of honesty she could no longer contain. Do you know what they call me out there? Some people think I'm lucky. Others think I'm shameless. To them, I'm not a woman. I'm just your accessory. And I don't know if you even realize how much that hurts. Sean's chest tightened. Ivy, do you know what it's like? She interrupted, her voice trembling. To pour your heart into something, only for people to dismiss it. And now, everything I've worked for feels smaller because they think I'm just standing in your shadow. He stepped closer, but she flinched back. I don't want to be hidden, she whispered. But I also don't want to be exposed like this. And sometimes it feels like you're ashamed to fight for me. Her words pierced him deeper than any boardroom criticism ever could. He caught her hand before she could retreat further. I'm not ashamed of you, he said firmly, his voice breaking at the edges. I am terrified of losing you. This world I live in, it's ruthless. It chews people up. I know what it did to me, and I can't. He stopped, his grip softening. I can't let it do that to you. Her eyes shimmered with tears. Maybe the problem is, you're still trying to protect me instead of standing with me. Silence fell, sharp and heavy. Both breathing unevenly, both caught between love and fear. And yet, even through the storm, their hands didn't let go. 2 days later, Sean's world buckled. It began with a leaked memo. Nothing catastrophic, just careless timing. But paired with headlines about his distraction, it was enough to send partners into panic. Calls flooded his office. Investors whispered. His assistant stood in the doorway with files she didn't know how to frame. By afternoon, his chest tightened, breath coming shallow. The polished conference room blurred. He excused himself, barely making it to his car before the panic struck full. His hands shook on the steering wheel, his throat closing, his heart racing like it might tear through him. He didn't go home. His mansion felt like a tomb when he was like this. Instead, he drove, hands trembling, until he found himself at Ivy's door. She opened it and froze, taking in the sight of him. Disheveled, pale, his control shattered. Without a word, she pulled him inside. Sit, she whispered, guiding him to the couch. His chest rose in ragged gasps, eyes unfocused. She knelt before him, both hands holding his face gently. Breathe with me, Sean. Just breathe. She inhaled slowly, exhaled softly. At first he couldn't follow, but her steady rhythm anchored him. Her thumbs stroked his cheeks as she repeated the motion. In, out, in, out. Finally, his breaths began to match hers. His trembling eased, though tears slid unbidden down his face. He tried to turn away, ashamed, but she wouldn't let him. "Don't hide," Ivy whispered. "Not from me." Something in him broke, not painfully, but like chains snapping. He leaned forward, his forehead pressed against hers, his body shaking with the weight of everything he'd held in. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, his voice raw. "I don't know how to be a man who can love and not fail." "You don't have to know," she said softly. "You just have to be here, with me." She began to hum then, low and gentle, a melody meant only for him. The sound wrapped around his heart, softening every edge. He closed his eyes, letting her voice carry him back from the brink. It was the first time he cried in someone's arms without shame, and for Ivy, it was the first time she realized just how deeply her voice could heal. When the storm in him finally quieted, Sean lay back against the couch, Ivy curled against his side. The room was still, save for the faint patter of rain against the windows. Neither spoke for a long while. Their silence wasn't empty, it was full of understanding, of wounds acknowledged and love unspoken. At last, Ivy whispered, "Why do you keep coming back to me?" Sean turned his head, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Because with you, I feel like a man again. Not a headline, not a brand, just me." Her fingers curled into his shirt, her breath steady against his chest. She didn't say the words she wanted to, not yet. But in her heart, she knew she loved him. And Sean, though he hadn't said it either, made a silent vow in that moment. No matter how loud the world became, no matter how many storms rose against them, he would not let her go. Because she wasn't just a woman he loved. She was the voice that had healed him. And he would spend the rest of his days proving he was worthy of that gift. Sean had always believed he could control his world. Markets, contracts, mergers, he could shape them, bend them, master them. But his own heart, his own scars, they slipped through his grip every time. In the weeks after the confrontation, the pressure mounted. The media quieted for a while, but whispers remained. At board meetings, his partners spoke with tight smiles. At night, the insomnia clawed its way back. One evening, Ivy called him, and he didn't answer. He sat in his mansion, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Lights sparkled below him, but he felt no connection to them. He pressed his palms into his eyes until colors danced, his chest heavy, his mind circling the same refrain, "She deserves better. She deserves someone whole." When his phone buzzed again, her name lighting up the screen, he let it ring until it faded into silence. But Ivy wasn't one to let silence win. The next night, Sean walked into the cafe. He had planned not to, had told himself distance was safer, but his feet betrayed him, carrying him to the one place where his heart still remembered peace. Ivy was already on stage, singing softly, her voice wrapping around the room like silk. When her eyes found his, something flickered there, not relief, not surprise, but certainty, as though she had expected him all along. After the set, she slipped into the seat across from him, her expression gentle but firm. "You didn't answer yesterday," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to see me like that," Sean admitted, his voice low. Her hand reached across the table, covering his. "Sean, you don't have to be perfect with me. You don't have to be strong every second. You just have to be here." He swallowed hard, his throat aching. "You don't know how dark it gets inside me." "I don't need to know every shadow," she replied softly. "I just need you to let me bring light where I can." That night, Ivy invited him back to her apartment. He hesitated, worried he would weigh her down with his unrest, but she smiled and said, "Come, let me sing for you." So he followed her into her small living room, the space that smelled faintly of lavender and tea. She picked up her guitar, sat cross-legged on the couch, and looked at him. "This one isn't for the cafe," she said. "It's just for you." And then she sang. Her voice was lower than usual, softer, weaving through the quiet room like a lullaby. She sang not of perfection but of brokenness, of how scars don't make us unlovable, how healing isn't about being fixed but about being held. Sean sat back, his chest tight, his eyes closing as the music poured through him. His breath steadied, his heart slowed. For the first time in years, the noise in his mind quieted, not silenced, but soothed. When the song ended, tears streaked his face. He didn't wipe them away. He simply looked at her and whispered, "You're saving me." Ivy set the guitar aside and moved closer, her hand resting against his cheek. "No, Sean, I'm reminding you that you were never beyond saving." He leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling. The moment held them both, fragile, tender, unshakable. And for the first time, Sean believed that maybe, just maybe, love could heal him. The song still lingered in the room, soft as candlelight. Sean's forehead rested against Ivy's, his breath uneven, his heart finally beginning to steady. For a long moment, they just sat there, letting the silence stretch, a silence that felt more sacred than any words. When she leaned back, her hand stayed on his cheek, her thumb brushing lightly over the trail of his tears. Her eyes searched his, not with judgment, but with warmth so profound it nearly undid him. "You don't always have to be strong with me," Ivy whispered. "And you don't always have to be perfect," Sean replied, his voice rough but steady. "I don't need perfection. I just need you." Their lips met then, slow and searching, the kiss deepening not in urgency but in meaning. It was tender, sensual, full of all the words they hadn't said aloud. His hand slipped to the small of her back, hers slid up to his neck, anchoring him to her. When they pulled apart, they stayed close, foreheads pressed, their breaths mingling. They spent the night together, not in the way of passion rushed, but of intimacy shared. They lay curled on her couch, then later in her bed, fully clothed, his arm around her waist, her head on his chest. Her fingers traced circles against his shirt absent-mindedly while he whispered, things he hadn't told anyone, that he sometimes woke in panic, at 3 a.m., that he still heard the voice of betrayal in his head, that he feared one day she would see the worst in him and walk away. "I'm not leaving," she murmured against his chest. "Even if you break. Especially if you break." Sean closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the truth of her words. For the first time in years, he fell asleep in someone's arms, and the dreams that came were not of loss or betrayal, but of warmth, laughter, and Ivy's voice, carrying him through the storm. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through Ivy's curtains. Sean woke to find her already awake, propped on one elbow, watching him with a soft smile. "You look different when you sleep," she teased lightly. Less CEO, more boy who finally found peace. He laughed quietly, the sound rusty but real. "Maybe that's because, for once, I did." They spent the morning slowly, deliberately. She brewed tea, he washed the mugs. They talked about simple things, her childhood songs, his first memory of the ocean, the way they both loved rainy nights more than sunny days. Later, they sat by her window, the city moving below them while they stayed cocooned in their own little world. "I don't know how to explain this," Sean said, his gaze fixed on the street. "But being with you, it feels like I can breathe again, and I don't want to lose that." Ivy reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then don't lose it, don't run from it. We'll figure the rest out together." The word together settled deep into him, heavier than any promise he had ever signed. That evening, as the sky turned dusky purple, Ivy asked him to sit on the couch again while she played something new. This song wasn't about sorrow or pain, it was about love found in unexpected places. Her voice was playful, warm, alive. Sean listened with a smile tugging at his lips, his chest lighter than it had been in years. When she finished, he crossed the room, took the guitar gently from her hands and set it aside. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his lips finding hers. Again, this time with the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. Their kiss deepened, hands exploring safe, tender places, every touch charged with longing but anchored in love. They didn't rush, didn't push, didn't need to. The intimacy was already there, thick in the air, sweet in the way they breathed each other in. When they finally rested, tangled together on the couch, Ivy's head against his chest, Sean whispered into her hair. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again." Ivy smiled softly, her hand tightening on his shirt. "And you've given me proof that love is worth the risk." They drifted into sleep like that, wrapped in each other, the world outside irrelevant. For Sean, it was not just healing. It was redemption. For Ivy, it was not just love. It was purpose fulfilled. And together, it was the beginning of something unshakable. Months passed, and with them, the noise of the world began to quiet. Headlines moved on, whispers faded, but Sean and Ivy's bond only deepened. Sean no longer hid his affection. He arrived at the cafe openly, his presence a silent declaration that he wasn't ashamed. And Ivy? She sang brighter, fuller, as though every note carried the strength of what they had endured together. It was on one of those nights, after she'd finished a set, that Sean took her hand and said, "It's time." "Time for what?" she asked, eyes curious. "For your dream." He had invested, not to own her, not to control her, but to empower her. The music studio she had spoken about, the one she feared was impossible, now stood tall, its doors ready to open. When Ivy stepped inside for the first time, her breath caught. Sunlight spilled across polished floors, walls lined with instruments, microphones waiting for voices that had yet to be heard. It wasn't just a studio. It was a sanctuary. Her eyes shimmered with tears as she turned to him. "You did this for me?" Sean shook his head. "No, I did it with you, for every voice you'll inspire, for every heart you'll heal. This is yours, Ivy, and I'm just grateful I get to witness it." She threw her arms around him, laughter and tears mingling. For the first time in his life, Sean didn't feel like a man buying something. He felt like a man giving himself away, fully, to love. The night of the opening, the studio buzzed with life. Friends, musicians, and strangers filled the space, all drawn by Ivy's voice. Sean stood in the crowd, not as a billionaire watching a project, but as a man watching the woman he loved shine. When Ivy stepped onto the stage, the room hushed. She glanced at Sean, her eyes finding his instantly, and smiled. "This song," she said softly into the microphone, "isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever thought they were too broken to be loved. To anyone who's ever carried scars and thought they'd never heal. I sing this tonight because someone reminded me that hope is stronger than pain, and love is braver than fear." Her voice rose, filling the studio, filling Sean, filling everyone who had ever doubted themselves. Each note was a promise that healing was possible, that love could rebuild even the most shattered soul. Sean felt his chest tighten, tears pricking his eyes, but this time he didn't hide them. He let them fall because they were not tears of regret anymore. They were tears of healing. When the final note faded, the room erupted in applause. But Sean only saw her. After the crowd dispersed, Sean found Ivy backstage. She still glowed from the performance, her eyes alight with joy. He stepped close, cupping her face gently, his forehead resting against hers. "You didn't just heal me," he whispered. "You gave me back my life, and you gave me a reason to believe in mine." Ivy replied, her voice trembling with emotion. Their lips met, soft but full of everything they had endured, everything they had become. Around them, the studio hummed with the promise of music yet to be made, stories yet to be told, lives yet to be touched. Their love had begun in brokenness, but it had grown into hope. And hope, they realized, was the greatest wealth of all. Dear friends, what you've just experienced is more than a love story. It's a reminder, no heart is too broken, no soul too wounded, to be healed by love and hope. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing is possible, and drop a comment below telling us, do you believe love can truly heal the deepest scars? And if you're new here, subscribe to Mr. Leonardo Stories so you never miss a journey of love, redemption, and hope. Because together, we'll keep telling stories that remind us all, even in the darkest nights, Love's light will always find a way through.